Hello, good evening. I prepared a presentation on second order change in psychotherapy and how and if it is a necessary requirement in the process of getting to know things better, someone about himself or the unit he belongs, either family or a wider system. The subtitle is Remaining Sane in Insane Places. Well, Theodore Zeldin, who is a member of the European Academy, says that there are plants that have difficulty multiplying with seeds. In order for someone to cultivate new habits, it's best to use the gardening technique of vaccination. The conflict between the old and the new usually provokes painful processes, but vaccination is the common healing of the wounds. The discovery of the common pain has always been considered the best compromise for the peaceful coexistence between the rational and the irrational. The special task of the social scientist in each generation is to pin down the contemporary facts. Beyond that, he says, with the humanist scholar and the artist, in the effort to gain insight into contemporary relationships. Not seldom, it seems we have been attributed the role of curators in the land of forbidden cure. Plato, in his dialogue of Phaedon, used to say that there exist the following categories of souls. At the first level, the souls of gods and of their fellow travelers, and at the second level, the pure souls, which are sent to earth in order to save the third category of souls, namely those that are corrupt. Even the souls that have fallen from grace were pure some time earlier. Thus, they contain in themselves a priori knowledge. Well, communities of commitment. After unending struggles between geocentric and heliocentric cosmologies, Einstein's relativity muted the question of the center around which all else revolves. In a theory of relativity, every point of the universe can work as a center. The choice is more a matter of convenience than of truth, and by the same token, the system's worldview do not strive to find the answer, but to re-establish our perspective as a living system within other living systems, and thereby to recreate the only genuine context for change, that is, communities of commitment. Now, an important aspect of the researcher's model is the concept of the order or magnitude of change. Different perceptions about the implications of change mean that the change that appears to be a solution to one person can appear to be a problem for another, or what seems to be the solution for a country, in this case Greece, might be a problem for a whole continent. A number of basic principles underlie the functioning of natural groups and must be taken into account in order to work with them therapeutically. Much confusion and conflict among schools of psychological thought arise from a failure to formulate such underlying assumptions systematically. Now, if you want to see what is first order change and then second order change, you'll see that first order change is change that is consistent with prevailing values and norms, meets with general agreement, and can be implemented using people's existing knowledge and skills. All right? First order change implies changing the individuals in a setting to attempt to fix a problem. First order change implies a logical extension of past and current practices. Actions associated with the first order change represent incremental improvements. First order change is doing more or less of something we are already doing. First order change is always reversible. Now, what is second order change? Second order change implies a fundamental or significant break with past and current practices. This type of change represents a dramatic difference in current practices. Second order changes require new knowledge and skills for successful implementation. A change becomes second order when it is not obvious how it will make things better. It requires people to learn new approaches since it conflicts with prevailing values and norms. Second-order changes require leaders, or therapists in this case, to work for more deeply with staff and the community. They can disrupt people's sense of well-being and the cooperation and cohesion of the school community, for example. They may confront and challenge expertise and competencies and throw people into states of conscious incompetence. Second-order change is destabilizing what we already know, okay? Second-order change is deciding or being forced to do something significantly or fundamentally different from what you have done before. The process is irreversible. Once you begin, it is impossible to return to the way you were doing it before. Now we would like to have a look at the key characteristic differences between first and second order change. We'll have a look, a quick glance. First order change. We are doing adjustments within the existing system, okay? Second order change, it's change of the existing system, new way of seeing things. In the first case, we are doing more or less of the same thing. Often begins through the informal system second order change, trying things outside the box. We can see this coming through the social media. Too many changes are going through the informal system, which is now the Facebook, the Twitter, and all this stuff. First order change is generally reversible, whereas second order change is irreversible. It is non-transformational in the first case, and it is transformational in the second case. Not much new learning needs to take place in the first case, whereas at the second occasion, we need to learn new things and start becoming more complicated, organize our complexities as persons, as individuals, as families, as societies, etc., etc. No fundamental shift in values or behaviors when we are going through the first order changes, whereas in the second order change, we have fundamental shift in values or behaviors. We think things differently. We become aware of our responsibility in a multiple of complex levels of functioning. In the first case, all story can still be told, okay? I can consider myself the way I used to consider myself before. Nothing changes to the way I see myself, the way I function, the way I behave, the way I perceive the world, and etc., etc. So a new story needs to be restructured in the second case, okay? And it is far more difficult second order change. You can see this taking place in groups when people go in deep inside themselves. They stop accusing people. They start saying, oh, my mother is the problem, my father is the problem, if we are talking about adolescents, and they focus the lens inside themselves. What am I going to do if I go this way? What am I going to do if I go that way? So they become more existentially, let's say, focused on what they are as people beyond the environment and the influences they are exposed. In any situation, this is the psychological or social structure containing enough of the three subsystems, superego, ego, indeed, for autonomous function to be possible, the minimum sufficient network. So when a person comes, it is a structure of all these psychic parts, okay? And he knows how he functions anyway, or he has a certain, let's say, idea of what is possible and what it isn't possible. So he says, okay, or she says, that's how I am, I can't change. And they know that if they go, to a certain degree of a certain belief and perception about themselves, nothing is going to change. But if they go further, they can see that they can actually change things inside themselves. But this takes time anyway. Usually in cases which respond well to individual psychotherapy casework, the three subsystems are adequately developed within the individual to permit communication within the intrapsychic network to a sufficient degree without much need to involve others, without much need to bring the family in, to start doing other kind of interventions. But where developmental arrest due to deprivation or trauma has led to these structures remaining dispersed among a number of people, the only autonomous system will be the group, the therapeutic in this case, containing those individuals, and treatment must go beyond interpsychic exploration and interpretation to facilitate communication between the persons involved. Systemic therapy needs to take more aspects in account, more aspects of the environment and the context where people live and function. Now, the following principles elaborate on the basic ideas that constitute the ways of thinking about clients and the process of change from a first-order cybernetic perspective. We acknowledge that some of these ideas could also fit second-order cybernetics, constructivism, and social constructionism. I have to go through these principles in a little bit of hurry because we started quite late. So the first principle has to do that behavior labeled as either problematic, mad, or bad, or non-problematic, sane or good is normal, or a part of the natural ecology in the context of a given relationship. So we need to reframe behaviors. If the behavior of someone makes sense in context, the presenting problem is viewed as a symptom of a disturbed relationship. Similarly, when relationships are viewed in context, the therapist sees normalcy of the disturbed relationship in the context of the larger system. So it's not a linear way of looking at things, okay? It's a circular way of looking at things. And it's far more difficult. The therapist understands as somewhat logical a unique response of a particular person and thus normalizes it rather than measuring the appropriateness or inappropriateness of the behavior or experience relative to some normative standard. Implicit in every theory of therapy, however, is a set of values or ideas about how one is supposed to be, do, feel, and think, and how one is not supposed to be, do, feel, and think. All right? No theories are value neutral. All theories of therapy are conscious designs for producing behavior, attitudes, beliefs, and feelings consistent with a specific set of values. Without a set of values, there are no problems in need of solution. Now, people are not simply the way they are independent of context. They are the way they are as a function of a given context. That is, their behaviors are contextually relative. People are not simply specific kinds or types of persons. They are the way they are with others as a function of the way others are with them. Each is a part of the context of the other. All right? Okay, the system is its own best explanation. The system is what it is and does what it does. In attempts to understand it, the focus is on current behavior. So instead of fixing, diagnosing, or stigmatizing a person, we need to think of process work, all right? So everything is a work in process. One cannot understand individuals out of context because people always exist in this. That to which people necessarily belong has no outside of them. If someone believes it's his reality of perceiving the world and how he understands and feels, it's his way of experiencing the world. You can't say things are different. That's the way he thinks how the context is and how he feels in it. Each client who presents for therapy lives within a natural network of relationships with others. These others relate to the client in a way that is logically consistent with the metaphors their society has assigned to the classes of behavior under which the client has been categorized. Examples, many examples. You can't take a person out of the context and say, look, you have to think of yourself that you are not the victim of this relationship because that's how he feels or she feels. So you have to reframe the whole story from the beginning, and it is quite a lot of work. Behaving with the client in a way that is logically consistent with the metaphor assigned to a class of behavior maintains or escalates the behavior. We have to be aware where to punctuate, where to say, look, you start over the old story again and again, and you have to start thinking in other terms. And of course, this is a bit destabilized as a process at the beginning. But at the end, he or she might feel a lot relieved and much better. By way of illustration, consider the case of an adolescent, for example, who has been categorized as delinquent, all right? We know from the work of Winnicott, psychoanalytic literature, that delinquency is deprivation, emotional deprivation, okay? But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is the person who actually forces the system to change, okay? And the person, usually the adolescent, contains what the rest of the system denies, okay? And unless you know what the history, you know, the story in the family is, okay, you can't actually pinpoint that this is happening. But if you do some tests and understand things in depth, using in-depth personality tests, for example, you can understand the dynamics of the family. So maybe the delinquent, inverted commas, acts out what the mother denies in herself, for example, okay? So then you can't take the delinquent as a person and start doing something with him or her without considering the rest of the system. When enough people, including parents, the school principal, counselors, the court, and so forth, tell the same story about the delinquent and behave in a way logically consistent with the metaphor delinquent, the story associated with the metaphor soon becomes the story the adolescent uses to describe himself or herself. Okay? So the self-perception becomes the metaphor. And it is very difficult to go away from there, all right? Because victimizing somebody in the system also stabilizes the system in a certain point. And it's difficult to change the equilibrium, the dynamic in the system. Well, anyway, people define their identity or sense of self relative to the context of the relationships of which they are part. Thus, there is no unified singular sense of self. Instead, each person has multiple selves that he or she experiences in the context of different relationships. Now, I don't know how many of you actually have been initiated in Facebook, okay? But the last year, although I was very, very, aggressive towards the idea, no, this is childish, this is for adolescents, etc., I started using it because my friends are away, they're living in different cities, etc. So I started reconnecting with them. And I started understanding that with each different person, I was behaving differently, you see, depending on where our relationship had stopped. For example, rotten kid and mean teacher define and maintain the identity of the other. If you use a paradoxical intervention, for example, and you start destabilizing the rotten kid and the mean teacher, maybe they will understand that the one sustains the other. Is it clear what I'm just trying to let you understand? So a person's identity is closely tied to the relationships in his or her life. One's experience of the person he or she is contextually relative. That's the idea. When a first-order Sabertisian is asked, what kind of person is Kevin, for example, Anna? The appropriate response would be, I don't know what kind of person Anna is. I only know how he is with me when I am the way I am with her or with me, with him. And I can only tell you my story about Kevin or Anna or whatever, and my story says more about me than it does about the other person. How many times have you faced this in your life? And how many times someone came to you and said, oh, I thought you believed this and that about myself. Oh, never. And suddenly it becomes manifest and more than obvious that how he thinks about himself actually influences the way others see him and vice versa. So this is a very, very important aspect and parameter regarding clear and precise communication. Otherwise, there are going to be many, many misunderstandings and many, many disorders in communication. So change occurs as a function of a change in context. Change in context equals change. If the context within which a behavior occurs remains the same, it is likely that the behavior will continue or will escalate. So you have to put a break. And I want to skip all these because more or less we are going to talk about the same thing, and I don't want to go further. And this is interesting. When attempting to solve problems, people often commit the environmental fallacy. That is, each problem has a context or an environment in which it is intricately embedded. That context or environment is far more difficult to perceive than the problem as punctuated by society. The problem could be somewhere else, not to the person who is actually asking for help. When one fails to perceive the context of the problem, however, and evokes solutions that do not address it, he or she is committing what Chartman says the environmental fallacy. The fallacy of ignoring the environment and is participating in the creation of higher order problems. So the problems become cumulative. Cumulative? Yes, cumulative. So we need to take all this in mind. And of course, the definitions of first and second order change cybernetics have been expressed by different authors. This is not the time to go analytically to these, but I have few drafts with me, and I can actually pass them to you after the closing of the presentation. There are versions of cybernetics, of course. There are different versions about epistemological aspects of how reality is being constructed, okay? And now we're going to another very important aspect, the boundary maintenance, which is collapsing nowadays in all respects. And this is with the good and the bad aspect. All right? At the limits of the living thing of ourselves, dividing from the surrounding world is the boundary. This boundary permits or ensures that certain materials pass across, entering us from outside or passing from it out into the surroundings, while restricting or preventing the exchange of other elements. Failure now of the boundary to restrict exchange across it leads to a loss of difference between ourselves and our surroundings and our separate identity, no matter how we perceive this identity at this particular period of time. Okay? How we think we are. Too impermeable a boundary, preventing any exchange, okay, brings another form of death, the fixed and stained tissue you see beneath the microscope. On the psychological level, the formation and preservation of individual identity similarly requires effective boundaries or defenses, ensuring sufficient communication to transmit information adequately from one generation to another. In Greece, we have enormous chaotic fusion of intergenerational alliances, and this creates enormous problems between generations, okay? So the semi-permeable boundary of living systems, if we use, yes, I have to go more and more quickly, but usually presentations need to be as precise and as we can, but it's not so easy anyway. So we go again. So we are systems within systems, okay? And we need to take this into account. Not all societies go through the same stages, all right? In US, there are different stages for this particular society. For Britain, there are different stages of development and evolution. sociologically speaking. In Greece, we have different stages. So we can't compare, and we can't say that, okay, what applies here applies there. No, it's different, and each society goes through more varied stages of development and evolution. And we have different problems to face and fight, inverted commas, fight anyway, deal with, let's say. This presentation actually is the end product of many, many years of research in disturbed families and schizophrenia, who was my postgraduate research, and also clinical practice here in Greece. So it's very demanding for me to try to present all of these. For example, undifferentiated family ego mass. I don't know how many of you are actually familiar with the work of Bowen, okay? We can see that in schizophrenic families, the fused, the families actually containing schizophrenic members have excessively permeable boundaries between the individuals. Bowen and Leeds and Wine, magnificent research workers in the US decades ago, shown that schizophrenic pathology is associated with lack of clear boundaries between the generations. And they proved it. And the work of Bateson proved that, okay? I mean, that was the generation that actually had the privilege of taking enough money to go in depth and search things. Well, at the same time, such families appear to possess excessively rigid and impermeable boundaries between the family as a whole and the outside world. And of course, this is a graphic design of over-involved intra-family relationship together. Traditional structures of families usually have this kind of now I'm closing. One more minute, can I have? Okay, is change desirable, all right? Even if change is possible, even if it is possible, because sometimes it's not, and you have to accept that, all right? We must eliminate our omnipotence and become enough, how do you say, humane, to understand that certain systems are very difficult to change, all right? So even if change is possible in a given system, it still remains to decide whether it is desirable for the therapist to attempt it, okay? So ethical issues arise there, very important ethical issues and complex ethical issues. Here the value systems of the parties concerned need to be brought into relationship if the therapist is not unwittingly and with the best of intentions to impose his own needs and standards on a patient or family for whom quite different ambitions and requirements may already exist. Very delicate aspects. The therapist may feel that the merits he encounters would be unendurable for him, but it is not his merits, he did not choose to begin or continue it, and if it breaks up as a result of his efforts, he is not usually in a position to offer the spouses anything better. All right? So the couple needs to be aware of what's going to take place if they start dealing in depth with themselves and each other. A child's life, for example, may seem insufferable in terms of the therapist's own childhood. But again, the life he seeks to offer to these children, unless he's going to adopt the child himself or arrange other alternative care, he may do nothing but harm if he arouses even greater dissatisfaction in the child or jealousy and rejection in the parents by giving too much of himself. So again, boundary maintenance, okay? So we've been through this, and we can see actually how the therapist collapses, having breakdown because they are trying too hard, all right? So when under supervision, the therapist understands that he's overdoing it, and it has to do with his own personal stuff that he has to deal before he starts to put certain limits between himself and the system he observes. So again, these are very important issues that we are going to actually talk later if we have time. And of course, this is my end slide, the last slide. And we have to think that we are here, anthropos, in the group, either the natural or the nuclear family that belongs to the community, belongs to the society, to the humanity at the end. So we are systems in very rapid transition. But, as Simone Weil used to say, the true road exists. And since you are here in Greece, I will close again with Plato, the same way I started. Many others followed the path Plato used to, but it's open only to those who, recognizing themselves to be incapable of finding it, give up looking for it, and yet do not cease to desire it to the exclusion of everything else. Thanks a lot for coming.